The air at the Henderson Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a soupy mix of late August humidity and the bitter-sweet smell of defeat. It was 1969, a time when a man's worth was measured in acres and horsepower, and Harold Henderson had run out of both. I stood near the back of the crowd, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my worn denim jeans, feeling the familiar grit of field dust in the seams. I wasn't there for the land. The bank would swallow that whole. I was a vulture of a different sort, picking over the bones of the iron. My name is Arthur Miller. Most folks just call me Art. My own place, the Miller homestead, was a modest quarter section just 3 miles down the road. It was all paid for, a fact that was a point of quiet pride for me, and a source of constant irritation for men like Mr. Henderson at the bank, who believed a farmer who wasn't in debt wasn't truly farming. My equipment was old but sound. A 1951 Farmall M my dad bought new, its 4-cylinder engine still barking to life on the first try. A John Deere 4010 from '63, the newest thing I owned, bought with 5 years of saved cash after a string of good harvests. They were mine, free and clear. No banker's signature on the title, no sleepless nights wondering about a payment. That's why I was here. My old John Deere 45 combine was reliable, but she was a 2-row machine, slow as a Sunday afternoon. With corn yields getting better every year, I was spending more time in the cab than I was with my family. I needed something bigger, but I wasn't about to walk into the dealership and sign my life away for a shiny new green or red machine. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Bill Gable, whose voice could cut through the roar of a straight-piped diesel, was working his way through the hay racks of tools and spare parts. Most of it was junk. Then they brought out the big iron. A decent-looking International 806 tractor went for a fair price. A New Holland baler that had seen better days brought a few half-hearted bids, and then they dragged it out from behind the barn. It was a Massey Ferguson 510. Even from 100 yards away, it was a monster, a stark contrast to my little JD 45. It had a 6-row corn head and a grain tank that looked big enough to swim in. It was also a complete and utter wreck. A collective groan rippled through the crowd. The machine listed to one side, its massive rear tire as flat as a pancake. The sheet metal was a patchwork of faded red paint and angry orange rust. The auger that swung out to unload the grain was bent at a sickening angle, like a broken arm. Someone had left the rain cap off the exhaust stack, a fatal sin for any engine left to sit. It was a carcass, a monument to neglect. I heard a loud, braying laugh cut through the murmurs. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Harold must have used that thing to anchor his boat." The voice belonged to Richard Peterson. Rich. We'd gone to high school together. His father had given him the keys to their 2 sections of prime bottomland and a line of credit at the bank that seemed to have no end. Rich was the new breed of farmer. He drove a brand-new Ford F-250, bought a new John Deere 6600 combine just last year, and talked about cash flow and depreciation like a man who'd never had grease under his fingernails. He saw my kind of farming, the kind my grandfather practiced after the Dust Bowl nearly wiped him out, as a fossil, a relic of a bygone era. I ignored him and walked closer, my boots sinking into the soft dirt. I ran a hand over the cold, rusted steel of the grain head. I peered into the engine compartment. It was a Perkins diesel, a 354 cubic inch straight 6, a good engine if it hadn't been abused. And this one had been abused. I could see mouse nests tucked into the wiring, and the whole block was coated in a greasy film of dirt and leaking oil. "Gonna put in a bid, Art?" Rich sneered, walking up beside me. He smelled of expensive cologne, a scent that was jarringly out of place here. "Could use it as a chicken coop. might be the most productive that thing's ever been. I just grunted and continued my inspection. I pulled the dipstick. It came out coated in a thick, milky sludge, water in the oil, a death sentence. The engine was seized, no doubt about it. The crowd was right. It was scrap. Bill Gable, the auctioneer, knew it too. "All right, folks, what do we bid for this? Agricultural antique," he started, his usual enthusiasm gone. "Let's start it at $500. Do I hear 500? Silence. The only sound was the wind rustling the dry corn stalks in the neighboring field. 400, 300. Come on, people. The scrap man will give you more than that. $200? A man in the front row, a known scrapper, held up a finger. 200, Gable acknowledged. I've got 2. Now who will give 250? More silence. Rich Peterson chuckled and shook his head, looking at me as if to say, "See? Junk?" My grandfather's voice echoed in my head, a memory from a long time ago as we sat on the porch swing. "Art," he'd said, his voice raspy with age. "Never look at what something is. Look at what it can be. And never, ever pay retail if you've got sweat in your arms and sense in your head." I thought of my little JD 45 and the weeks it would take me to get my corn out. I thought of the hours I'd spend, the fuel I'd burn, the risk of an early snow. Then I looked at the Massey. I saw the seized engine, the bent auger, the rust. But I also saw the heavy-duty final drives. I saw the massive grain tank. I saw the sheer, raw potential, buried under all that neglect. 250, I said, my voice clear and steady. Every head turned. The crowd parted a little, like I'd just confessed to a crime. Rich Peterson's smirk froze on his face, replaced by a look of genuine disbelief. The scrapper in the front shrugged and shook his head. He was out. Gable's eyes lit up. "I've got 250 from Art Miller. Do I hear 3? $300 for this fine piece of harvesting machinery?" He was laying it on thick now. The silence returned. It was just me. "Sold." Gable slammed his hand down on his ledger. "For $250 to Arthur Miller. Son, you just bought yourself a combine." A wave of laughter and pitying murmurs washed over the crowd. Rich walked past me, clapping me hard on the shoulder. "Congratulations, Art," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're the proud owner of the biggest damn paperweight in the county. Let me know if you need to borrow my new 6600 to harvest your fields this fall. I'll be done in a week." He walked away, laughing with his friends. I paid the clerk my $250 in cash and made arrangements to have the beast hauled to my farm. As I watched the lowboy trailer strain under the weight of my new purchase, I felt a strange sense of calm. They all saw a pile of junk. I saw a winter's worth of work. I saw a future free from payments. I saw an empire built not on credit, but on calloused hands and salvaged steel. Now, before I tell you what it took to bring that iron giant back from the dead, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been the one to see value where everyone else saw trash? Maybe it was an old truck, a piece of land, or just an idea that everyone laughed at. Drop a comment below and tell me about it, because that's the kind of story that built this country, and it's the very heart of what happened next. The Massey Ferguson 510 sat in my machine shed like a patient on an operating table. The long, cold Iowa winter of '69 settled in, sealing the farm in a blanket of snow and giving me the time I needed. Every morning, after my chores were done, I'd walk into the shed, the cold air stinging my lungs, and stare at the machine. It was an intimidating sight. The sheer scale of it was something else. To get to the engine, I had to climb a ladder. The first order of business was surgery. I needed to get that Perkins diesel out. I rigged up a chain hoist to the strongest beam in the shed, a massive piece of oak my grandfather had put there 50 years ago. It took me 2 full days of wrestling with rusted bolts, greasy connections, and wiring that had been chewed by generations of mice. I soaked every bolt in penetrating oil, heating the stubborn ones with an acetylene torch until they glowed cherry red, the metal groaning in protest before finally giving way. The smell of burning rust and old grease filled the shed. Finally, with a screech of tortured metal, the engine broke free from its mounts. I lowered it slowly, carefully, onto a heavy-duty engine stand I'd built from scrap iron. With the heart of the beast exposed on the stand, the true diagnosis began. I pulled the valve cover. Sludge. I pulled the head. The gasket was blown, and 2 of the cylinders were filled with rusty water. Just as I suspected, the engine was seized solid. I put a 2-foot breaker bar on the crankshaft bolt and pulled with all my weight. It didn't budge. Not 1/1000th of an inch. This was the point of no return. For the next week, I tore that engine down piece by piece. Every part was labeled and placed in coffee cans filled with diesel fuel to dissolve the years of grime. The pistons had to be driven out of the cylinders with a block of wood and a sledgehammer, a brutal, jarring process that made my teeth ache. When they finally came free, the sight was grim. The cylinder walls were scored and pitted with rust. The piston rings were fused into their grooves. The crankshaft journals were scarred. It was worse than I thought. Most men would have given up, called the scrapper, and admitted defeat. But admitting defeat wasn't in my blood. My grandfather had faced the Dust Bowl, had watched his neighbors pack up and head west, their hopes crumbling to dust just like their fields. He stayed. He fought. He survived. This was just metal. Metal could be fixed. My search for parts became an obsession. I wasn't going to the Massey dealer. Their prices would be more than the machine was worth. I was going to the boneyards. I spent my weekends driving my old Chevy pickup across Iowa and into Minnesota and Nebraska. I visited places with names like Acme Parts and Cornfield Salvage, vast frozen fields of dead and dying farm equipment. I walked for miles through rows of rusting combines, their cabs staring out with vacant, broken eyes. In a yard outside of Des Moines, I found a fire-damaged 5 and 10. The engine was toast, but I managed to salvage a good crankshaft and a set of connecting rods. In a small, family-run yard in southern Minnesota, I found a Perkins engine out of an old industrial generator that had thrown a rod but had a pristine block and a good cylinder head. I paid cash for it all, haggling with grizzled old men who understood the value of $1 and the satisfaction of bringing something back to life. The block and head went to a machine shop in Waterloo, run by an old German named Klaus. His shop was a relic from another time, filled with massive, belt-driven lathes and milling machines. The air was thick with the smell of cutting oil. Klaus looked at my parts, grunted, and said he could save them. He bored the cylinders 30,000ths over, decked the block, and did a valve job on the head. It cost me nearly $400, a significant hit to my savings, but it was the only way. While the engine work was being done, I focused on the rest of the combine. I used the torch and a hydraulic press to straighten the bent, unloading auger. It wasn't perfect, but it was straight enough to work. I climbed inside the grain tank with a wire brush and a scraper, spending days removing rust and patching pinholes. I replaced every single belt and bearing on the machine, ordering them from a catalogue and cross-referencing part numbers until my eyes burned. Word of my winter project got around the county. It was the main topic of conversation at the co-op coffee shop. "Heard Art Miller's trying to build a combine out of 3 dead ones," they'd say, laughing. Rich Peterson made it a point to drive by my place every week or so in his shiny truck. He'd slow down, look at the scattered parts in my shed, and just shake his head with a condescending smile. One afternoon, Mr. Henderson, the banker, paid me a visit. He pulled up in his Buick, looking uncomfortable as he stepped into my cluttered shed. "Arthur," he said, clearing his throat, "I hear you're undertaking quite a project here." "Just keeping busy, Mr. Henderson," I said, not stopping my work on the wiring harness. "Son, I know your father raised you to be cautious," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But farming is changing. You can't compete running 30-year-old tractors and a combine you piece together from a junkyard. We have financing programs, lines of credit. Rich Peterson just financed a new 4-wheel drive Steiger. That's the future, Art. You're going to be left in the dust." "I appreciate the advice," I said, my voice flat, "but I prefer to sleep at night." He left in a huff, and I was left alone with the smell of grease and my own stubborn determination. By March, the snow began to melt. Klaus called to tell me the engine block and head were ready. I drove to Waterloo and picked them up, marveling at the clean, cross-hatched pattern in the new cylinder bores and the perfectly ground valve seats. The reassembly was slow, methodical work. I washed every bolt, cleaned every passage. I plastigaged the new bearings, torqued the head bolts in the precise sequence the manual called for, and set the valve lash with a feeler gauge. It was a sacred ritual. Finally, the day came. The engine was back in the combine's frame, all the fuel lines connected, the radiator filled. I bled the air from the injector lines, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The starter groaned, turning the new engine over slowly at first. It turned faster, then caught. A huge cloud of black smoke billowed from the straight pipe, and then the shed was filled with the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, the deep, throaty, powerful rumble of a healthy Perkins 304 diesel engine running at a steady idle. I stood there for a long time, a slow smile spreading across my face. It was the sound of victory. The early 1970s arrived like a fever. The world suddenly decided it was hungry, and American farmers were there to feed it. In 1972, the Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest of their own, secretly bought nearly a quarter of the U.S. wheat crop. The deal, which became known as the Great Grain Robbery, sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Corn that had been $1 a bushel was suddenly $2, then $3. Soybeans followed suit. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butts, told us to plant fence row to fence row. And we did. It was a boom time, an era of unprecedented optimism in the heartland. For men like Rich Peterson, it was like striking oil. He was perfectly positioned. With his fleet of new, high-capacity equipment, he could farm more acres, faster and more efficiently than anyone. The soaring grain prices didn't just mean more income, they meant his land value skyrocketed. He leveraged that newfound equity at the bank, borrowing more and more money to expand his empire. He bought the Henderson place that had gone up for auction. Then he bought out Old Man Smithers to the north. His land holdings doubled, then tripled. He bought another brand-new combine, a Gleaner L2 with a silver cab that looked like a spaceship. He traded his Steiger for an even bigger one, a green monster with 8 massive tires. Rich was no longer just a farmer. He was an agribusinessman, the golden boy of the new era. He traded his Ford pickup for a Cadillac Eldorado and built his wife a new brick ranch house with white columns out front. Meanwhile, I was still running my old iron. The Massey 510, which the whole county had laughed at, performed flawlessly. That first fall, I had my corn out of the field in 10 days, a job that would have taken my old John Deere 45 over a month. The big Perkins engine didn't even break a sweat. I sat in that cab, high above the rows of golden corn, listening to that steady diesel rumble, and I knew I had made the right choice. The profits from those first couple of years were incredible, more money than my father had seen in a decade of farming. But I didn't do what Rich did. I didn't rush to the bank. I didn't buy more land at inflated prices. The ghost of my grandfather was always on my shoulder, whispering warnings about booms and the busts that inevitably followed. Instead of buying land, I invested in my farm. I paid cash to have the whole property pattern tiled, a massive undertaking that would improve my drainage and yields for decades to come. I built a new, bigger machine shed, a 60 by 120-foot pole building. I bought the steel and lumber myself, and with the help of a few old-timer neighbors who still believed in barn raisings over bank loans, we put it up ourselves over the course of a summer. To everyone else, I was a fool, a man sitting on a winning lottery ticket and refusing to cash it in. The talk at the co-op shifted from pity to bewilderment. "What's wrong with Art Miller?" they'd ask. "He's got the money. Land's not getting any cheaper. That boy's got no ambition." Rich, of course, was the most vocal critic. I saw him at the grain elevator one day. He pulled up in his Cadillac, the dust barely settling, before he was out and strutting over to me. "Still polishing that old junk, Art?" he said, gesturing with his thumb toward my Massey. "Heard you built a new shed. I just closed on the Henderson place. The bank couldn't give me the money fast enough. You ought to get in on this, man. We're not going to see prices like this again in our lifetime." "I'm doing all right, Rich," I said quietly. "All right?" He laughed, that loud, braying laugh. "I'm not doing all right. I'm doing fantastic. You're playing checkers while the rest of us are playing chess." He slapped me on the back again, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly, but felt like a shove. "You do you, I guess." I just nodded and watched him drive away, his tires spitting gravel. I felt a familiar pang of doubt. Was he right? Was I being too cautious? Was I letting a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity slip through my fingers because of old stories and a stubborn streak? A few weeks later, I had to go to the bank in town to deposit a check from the elevator. The lobby was quiet. Mr. Henderson saw me and waved me into his office. He was on the phone, leaning back in his big leather chair, a stack of papers on his desk. "That's right," he was saying into the receiver, a pencil tucked behind his ear. "The prime rate is going up again next quarter, so the variable rate on this operating note will adjust accordingly. Yes, I understand. Well, that's the risk you take." He hung up the phone and smiled at me, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Arthur, good to see you. Making a deposit, I hope?" "Yes, sir," I said, handing him the check. As he stamped it, my eyes fell on the stack of papers on his desk. It was a loan application, and Rich Peterson's name was printed in bold letters at the top. It was for his latest land purchase. I saw the loan amount, a number with so many zeros it made my head spin, and next to it, I saw the interest rate. It was already in the double digits, and then I saw the words Mr. Henderson had just said on the phone, typed in small print on the contract: variable rate. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. It was a feeling I couldn't quite name, a deep, instinctual dread passed down from my grandfather. All this easy money, all this frantic expansion, it felt brittle, unsteady. The air outside was warm and humid, the promise of a summer rain hanging heavy. But in that quiet bank office, I felt a chill. It was the smell of a coming storm, a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. It smelled of debt. It smelled of ruin. And I knew, right then and there, that while Rich Peterson was playing chess, he had no idea the board was about to be flipped over. The turn came not like a thunderclap, but like a slow, sickening fever that settled over the land. The year was 1980. It started with whispers on the radio, reports from Washington that felt a world away. President Carter had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union to protest their invasion of Afghanistan. To us, it wasn't about politics. It was about the bottom falling out of the market. The price of corn, which had seemed destined to climb forever, stumbled, then collapsed. The elevators were full, and the buyers were gone. Then the sky turned against us. The spring rains never came. The summer of 1980 was a scorcher, a brutal, relentless siege of heat. The sun beat down from a hazy, metallic sky, baking the fields until the black dirt turned to a fine, grey powder. The young corn plants, which should have been shoulder-high by July, were stunted and yellow, their leaves rolling up tight like cigars to conserve every precious drop of moisture. Day after day, we'd watch the horizon for the promise of a cloud, only to be met with an endless, mocking blue. The air grew thick with the smell of dust and dying crops. The boom years had made men forget the hard lessons of the past. They had built their empires on the assumption that the rain would always fall and the prices would always rise. Rich Peterson's empire was the biggest of them all. He was farming nearly 3,000 acres, a staggering amount of ground. His 2 big combines and fleet of massive tractors ran from dawn until well after dusk, the dust from his operations a constant haze on the horizon. But now, that dust wasn't from tillage. It was the topsoil itself, lifting and blowing away in the hot, dry wind. I saw the first real crack in his armor one blistering afternoon in late August. I was driving past one of his fields when I saw his big, silver Gleaner L2 combine sitting dead in the middle of a half-harvested cornfield. The field was a pathetic sight, the ears of corn small and poorly filled out. Rich was standing beside the machine, his hands on his hips, staring at it as if he could intimidate it back to life. I pulled my truck over and walked out to him. "Trouble, Rich?" I asked. He jumped, not having heard me approach. His face was slick with sweat and grime, his fancy shirt stained dark under the arms. The usual cocky smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, angry line. "Hydrostat," he bit out, kicking one of the huge front tires. "Thing just quit. Won't move an inch." The hydrostatic transmission on a machine like that was a complex and delicate piece of engineering. It wasn't something you could fix with a wrench and a hammer in the field. It was a dealer job, a costly one. "Dealer says they can't get a man out here till Friday," he seethed. "And the part has to be ordered from Illinois. Gonna be $5,000 if it's a penny." $5,000. In a year when the corn was barely making 50 bushels to the acre and the price was in the tank, that was a catastrophic bill. It was more money than I had spent on parts for all my equipment in the last 5 years combined. "Sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. Seeing a man's equipment fail in the middle of harvest is something you don't wish on anyone. "Yeah, well," he grumbled, not looking at me. "At least I've got another one." He gestured vaguely toward the other side of his vast holdings, but there was no confidence in his voice. He was stretched thin, and we both knew it. The pressure was getting to him. The easy credit, the endless expansion. It all depended on everything going right. And for the first time in a decade, everything was going wrong. As I drove away, I glanced back at the gleaming, futuristic machine, sitting silent and helpless in the dying field. It looked like a beached whale. It was powerful, expensive, and utterly useless. That evening, after my own chores were done, I went out to my shed. I fired up the old Massey 510. The Perkins diesel coughed to life, settling into its familiar, comforting rumble. I checked the oil, greased the fittings, and topped off the fuel tank. She was old. She was patched together. But she was mine, and she would run. The drought and the embargo were only the beginning. The real killer, the one that stalked the countryside like an invisible plague, was happening in the quiet, carpeted offices of the Federal Reserve. To fight the runaway inflation of the late 70s, the chairman, Paul Volcker, jacked up interest rates to levels nobody had ever seen. The prime rate, the number that dictated everything, climbed past 15, then 18, then an unthinkable 20%. For me, it was just a number on the evening news. I had no operating loans, no mortgages. But for Rich Peterson, and thousands like him, it was a death sentence. That little line of text on his loan documents, variable rate, had become a guillotine. The interest on his massive debt was compounding at a terrifying speed. The payments he owed the bank were doubling, then tripling, even as his income from the withered crops vanished. The atmosphere in our small community changed. The easy laughter at the co-op coffee shop was replaced by grim, hushed conversations. Men who had been farming for 40 years suddenly looked old and beaten, their faces etched with a worry so deep it seemed to have settled in their bones. The local paper, once filled with ads for new tractors and seed corn, was now thick with auction notices. Every week, another neighbor went under. The Henderson farm, the Smithers place, the very lands Rich had so proudly bought, were being sold off piece by piece on the courthouse steps. Rich's downfall was as spectacular as his rise. He fought it at first. He sold off one of the new combines, then the big Steiger tractor, taking huge losses on them. The Cadillac disappeared, replaced by a rusty, 10-year-old Ford pickup. He and his wife stopped coming to church. You'd see him in town, and he'd look right through you, his eyes hollow. The swagger was gone, replaced by a desperate, haunted energy. I saw Mr. Henderson, the banker, one afternoon. He was putting gas in his Buick, and he looked like he'd aged 20 years. His suit was rumpled, his face pale. He saw me and just gave a weak, tired nod. The man who had preached the gospel of debt, who had told me I was being left in the dust, now looked like a pallbearer at his own funeral. The bank was drowning in bad loans, repossessing farms they couldn't sell because land values had crashed by more than half. The chess game was over, and everyone had lost. The final notice came in the spring of 1983, a full-page ad in the paper, public auction, by order of the First National Bank of Grafton County, the real and personal property of Peterson Farms, Inc. The list went on for 2 columns. Over 2,000 acres of prime Iowa farmland, a brick ranch house, and a line of machinery that, just a few years earlier, had been the envy of the entire county. I knew I had to go, not to gloat, but to bear witness. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a raw March wind whipping across the muddy farmyard. The crowd was huge, but it was a somber, quiet gathering. These weren't hopeful buyers looking for a deal. They were neighbours, friends and vultures, all come to pick over the bones of a fallen giant. I saw men I'd known my whole life, their faces grim, knowing that it could have just as easily been them. Rich was there, standing off to the side with his wife and 2 young kids. He looked like a stranger in his own yard. He was thin, his work coat hanging off his shoulders. His wife was trying to keep the children close, her face a mask of strained composure. He saw me, and for a moment our eyes met across the crowd. There was no anger in his gaze, no resentment, just a profound, bottomless exhaustion. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and looked away. The auctioneer started with the machinery. The big Gleaner combine, the one that had broken down in the field, went for less than a quarter of what Rich had paid for it. The tractors, the planters, the tillage equipment, it all sold for pennies on the dollar to opportunistic buyers from out of state. With every slam of the gavel, I could see Rich flinch, another piece of his life being hammered away. Then came the land. They sold it off in parcels. The Henderson place went first, then the Smithers farm. Finally they came to the last parcel, the one listed as Tract A. It was the original Peterson home quarter section, 160 acres, with the new brick house and the outbuildings. This was the land his father and grandfather had farmed, the heart of it all. The bidding started low. The crowd was hesitant. Buying land, even at these prices, felt like a risk. The bidding stalled. The auctioneer tried to work the crowd, but the enthusiasm just wasn't there. And in that silence, I heard my grandfather's voice again, not the one that warned of debt, but the one that spoke of community, of decency. I thought of Rich's kids, their bewildered faces. I thought of what it meant to lose your home place, the land that held your family's history in its very soil. I raised my hand. 50,000, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet. It was a low price, but it was a solid bid. A few heads turned. The auctioneer's eyes found me. I have 50,000 from Art Miller. Another bidder countered. We went back and forth a few times, the bids climbing slowly. Finally, the other bidder shook his head and dropped out. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel falling with a sharp crack that echoed in the cold air. For $72,000 to Arthur Miller. A murmur went through the crowd. I felt their eyes on me, trying to understand. I wasn't an empire builder. I wasn't a speculator. What was I doing? I ignored them. I walked over to the clerk's table to sign the papers, my hand steady. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a heavy sense of responsibility. After the auction was over and the crowd began to disperse, I saw Rich still standing by his pickup truck, staring at the house that was no longer his. I walked over to him. He didn't look up as I approached. "Art," he said, his voice rough. "Come to enjoy the show?" "No," I said quietly. I didn't. We stood in silence for a long moment, the wind whistling around the corner of the barn. "I don't expect you to understand, Rich," I began, choosing my words carefully. "But that home place, it shouldn't be owned by a bank or some stranger from another state." He finally looked at me, his eyes guarded, suspicious. "So you bought it. Gonna farm it yourself?" "I've got enough to keep me busy," I said. I took a deep breath. "Here's what I was thinking. You need a place to live. Your family needs a home. And that ground needs a farmer who knows it. I'll rent the house and the farm to you. We'll work out a price you can afford. And if things ever turn around for you, we can talk about you buying it back." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He was speechless. The pride, the anger, the years of rivalry, it all seemed to melt away, leaving behind a raw, vulnerable man. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He just shook his head, and I saw his eyes glisten with tears he was fighting to hold back. "Why?" he finally managed to ask, his voice a hoarse whisper. "After all the crap I gave you. Why would you do this?" I thought for a moment, looking out over the fields that stretched to the horizon. "Because my granddad always said that the only thing more important than the land is your neighbors," I said. "We all got hit by the same storm, Rich. Some of us were just lucky enough to be standing in a better spot." He didn't say anything else. He just stuck out his hand, his grip firm and calloused. It was the first time we had ever shaken hands as equals. In that moment, standing in the ruins of his fallen empire, we weren't rivals anymore. We were just two farmers, bound by a shared love for the dirt under our feet. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm crisis slowly receded, and a fragile sense of stability returned to the heartland. I never got rich, not in the way Rich Peterson had tried to. I never bought a new Cadillac or a fancy tractor. My net worth was in my soil, in my debt-free ledger, and in the peace of mind that let me sleep soundly every night, no matter what the interest rates were doing. Rich and his family stayed on the home farm. He worked harder than I had ever seen him work, farming the land he rented from me with a quiet, fierce dedication. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, hard-won humility. We became friends in a way. We'd help each other during harvest, share tools, and sometimes just sit on the tailgate of a pickup and talk about the weather. He never missed a rent payment. The community's perception of me had changed. The old-timers at the co-op no longer saw me as the eccentric fool with the junkyard combine. They saw me as a survivor, a man who had seen the storm coming and had built his house on a rock. Young farmers, just starting out, would sometimes stop by my shed, asking for advice. They'd look at my old, well-maintained equipment, a stark contrast to the shiny financed machinery on the dealer lots. One crisp autumn afternoon, many years later, my own son, David, who was then in high school, was helping me in the shop. We were getting the old Massey 510 ready for harvest. She was showing her age, her red paint faded to a dull orange, her sheet metal bearing the dents and scrapes of decades of hard work. But the Perkins diesel still fired up on the first try, its rumble as steady and reliable as the turning of the seasons. "Dad," David said, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, "why don't we get a new combine? Or at least a newer one? Mr. Peterson next door just got that used Case IH. It's got a cab with air conditioning." I stopped turning the wrench and looked at the massive machine that had, in so many ways, defined my life. I thought of the auction where I bought it, the jeers of the crowd, the long winter nights I spent bringing it back from the dead. I thought of the boom years, when it had allowed me to prosper without selling my soul to the bank, and I thought of the bust, when its simple, reliable nature had been my shield against the ruin that had claimed so many others. I put my hand on the big rear tire, the rubber worn smooth with age. "David," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "I want you to look at this machine. Everyone else saw a pile of scrap metal, a $250 mistake. They only saw what it was." I paused, letting the weight of the word settle in the quiet shed. "But you have to learn to see what something can be," I continued, looking my son straight in the eye. "This combine taught me the most important lesson I ever learned. It's not about having the newest or the biggest. It's about owning what you have. It's about freedom. The freedom from a banker's signature. The freedom from sleepless nights. Never ever pay a man interest for something you can build or fix or earn with your own two hands." I reached into the cab and turned the key. The starter groaned for a moment, and then the shed filled with that beautiful, deep-throated roar, the sound of independence, the sound of a legacy. It was the sound of an empire built not on credit or ambition, but on salvaged steel and the quiet wisdom of knowing when enough is enough. And as the smoke cleared from the exhaust pipe, I saw in my son's eyes that he was finally beginning to understand.